So, First Minister, thank you for taking the time out of an extremely busy schedule to speak to us. I guess we should start by asking how you're faring at the moment. How does this coping with a pandemic get any easier with time?
It's a tough situation, but I try to remind myself every day right now just how fortunate I am. I, thank goodness, haven't yet had any members of my family affected by this virus. I don't work on the front line of the health and care system, although I have family members that do. So I'm a lot more fortunate than many people are right now. But, in my position, of course, it's a difficult challenge. I've never dealt with a situation quite this big and serious before. That will be true of leaders everywhere. So I'm trying to do the best I can. Of course, I'm human. I know it's difficult for people sometimes to accept that politicians are human. So there's an emotional impact of all of this on me, just as there is on everybody else right now. But it's just important that I get on and take the best decisions I can to do the best to protect the country that I can. And that's the only thing really that drives me right now every single day.
I mentioned your schedule there. Tell us briefly what an average day in the life of a First Minister looks like at the moment.
I'm not sure that is ever an average day in the life of a First Minister at the best of times, but that's certainly even more true right now. In some respects, it's very different because just like everybody else, I'm not. So normally, a day in the life of the First Minister would mean lots of meetings, lots of, shaking hands and sitting down face to face with people and talking about different things, visiting places, hospitals, schools, businesses. Clearly, I'm not doing all of that right now because just like everybody else, I've got to comply with the social distancing rules. So right now, most of my days are spent here in St Andrew's House, talking to lots of people on the phone and over video, doing my daily update and just working through, reading a lot, obviously getting lots of advice, reading a lot of expert opinion about the things we need to do or think about doing, and just taking lots of decisions designed to get us through this as best we can. The days are long and tend to go well into the night, but that's what you would expect, I guess, given the magnitude of what we're dealing with.
We do have a few topics we'd like to discuss with you, but the one that's been brought up most by our listeners, and you probably wish you had a definite answer to this, I'm sure, surrounds when people will be able to see and spend time with loved ones again. Now, obviously, there's been some discussion about potentially allowing people to see small pockets of friends or family from outside their households as restrictions are eased. Can you elaborate at all on exactly what that will look like?
Well, not precisely right now. What I've said, and I think this is so important because, all of this is about our lives, the lives of all of us. So as we think about some of the options for the future, I want to be open about that. And so we set out a framework last week for how we'll take these decisions, what factors will have to be taken into account. Over the course of the next week, we'll set out a bit more detail of the kind of options we are looking at to try to be as open and transparent about that as possible. But I think it's also important for me to say right now that when I share some of the options that we are looking at, it won't necessarily mean that we are able to implement all of these options straight away or even in the foreseeable future. Because the most important thing for me to stress right now is that we think we are suppressing the virus, but we're only doing that because we're all living our lives in this very restrictive way. And the way viruses work, the margins that we operate in here are very, very narrow. So as we start to ease up on these restrictions, there is a very big risk that the virus starts to run out of control again. In fact, in some countries, Germany, for example, who have already eased up some of these restrictions, they're already finding that the virus is starting to spread a bit more quickly again. So we're going to have to be very, very careful. And it's likely to be the case that these restrictions are lifted very slowly, very gradually, and in a very phased way. And also some of them, not all of them, but some of them might be in place for quite a long time to come because the virus, we might suppress it, but it's not going to magically disappear. So we may have to live with some kind of social distancing, keeping 2 meters apart from each other, limiting the amount of people we see outside of our own households for maybe the rest of this year or beyond. And I know that's really tough for people to hear, but until we get to the point, which hopefully we will, and hopefully it will be sooner than any of us think right now, but we don't know that. But until we get to a point where we have a vaccine or at least some treatments that help us to mitigate the symptoms and the impact of this virus, we're going to have to continue to do everything that we can to suppress it. So I want to get as much normality back into people's lives as quickly as I possibly can, but I don't want to run the risk of the virus running out of control and killing even more people. And that's going to be a really difficult, really complex balance to strike.
You touched on there restricting the number of people that you can see from out with your household. Obviously, at the moment, we're encouraged not to see people from out with a household as long as we can help it, unless it's for essential work, etc. I suppose people are just looking for some kind of guarantee, and it's maybe something you can't give at the moment, as to, will they be able to go and see granny or their parents again before the end of this year? Is there a possibility that might not be allowed before we get to the end of 2020?
Look, I can't give guarantees of anything right now, and I'm not going to do that before I feel that I confidently can, because the last thing I want to do is raise people's expectations just to dash them again. But of course, I don't want to be keeping people away from their loved ones for a minute longer than is necessary. I think that is particularly the true with grandparents and grandkids. I know, every night just now when I speak to my mum and dad on the phone, I can hear they're upset that they're not able to see my niece and nephew right now. So I know from my personal experience how tough this is. But we really need to take these decisions very carefully. And we know older people are more likely to die from this illness. Most deaths so far have been in the over 65 age group. So there is, and this is really, really difficult to say, but to grandparents out there really struggling with this, I know how tough it is, but the measures that we're asking you to take right now are hard now, but they are about trying to make sure that you're around to see your grandkids grow up. And that's the bottom line. And it doesn't make it any easier for you right now, but we won't do these things any longer than is absolutely necessary. There has been some talk of, over time, can we maybe extend what we mean by household? So you might have a couple of households that can interact with each other, or a few friends you can interact with in a sort of bubble, as long as they're not interacting with other people. And yeah, that's the kind of thing that we are keen to look at, to see whether that would be possible and not allow the virus to run out of control. So these are the kind of things, if it's safe to do, we want to be able to do as quickly as possible. But the final thing I would say, as you hear me talk about these things that we're looking at for the future and might be able to do in the future, don't forget that you're not allowed to do these things now. And it's really important, if we start to kind of ease up ourselves just now and think, well, you know what, it's safe for me just to nip and see one of my friends because, well, I've heard the First Minister say the number of people in intensive care has gone down. If we start to do these kind of things now, this virus is going to very quickly run out of control again, and actually we'll find that these restrictions have to be in place for longer. So please, please, please stick with it right now and be assured that we will ease these things up as soon as we think it's safe to do so.
We are, of course, due for another review of the lockdown measures soon. I believe it might be some point next week. The feeling I get from what you've been saying and others have been saying recently is that we're not expecting those measures to be lifted at that next review. Is that a fair prediction?
The next review date is next week. It's the 7th of May. You certainly will not see lockdown lifted in its entirety or anything remotely like it next week. And I think it's important to be clear about that. I can't guarantee any of these restrictions will be lifted next week because we're still studying the data, looking exactly at what is happening with the virus. But, of course, we will be looking equally to see whether there are any things that we could possibly ease up a little bit or lift if we think it's safe to do that. But I go back to my points. This is going to be probably quite slow. It's going to be gradual, and it's going to be on a very phased way. And one of the difficult things for somebody like me having to take these decisions, one of the really difficult things is there's no certainty about what the impact of these decisions will be. And, as I said a moment ago, some countries that have already eased things are finding that they might have to put restrictions back on because the virus is getting out of control again. So we will have to not just assess things in advance, but then monitor how things work in practice. Because if we say, okay, you can do X again, and then a couple of weeks later, the science tells us that actually that's allowed the virus to spread much more quickly again, we may have to go back the way. Now, I'm not saying any of this to depress people. I know how tough this is for everybody. But equally right now, and you hear it every single day, we know how much damage this virus does. So we must contain it and suppress it as much as possible. But we are also aware that a lockdown also does harm to people. It's really damaging the economy just now. People are feeling isolated. That has an impact on mental health. Domestic abuse can take a surge if people are living much more behind closed doors. There are other health impacts. People we know are less likely to go to the NHS for other conditions right now, which, please, if you have other conditions, go to the NHS, but we know people have been less likely to. So all of this has an impact. And so these decisions over the next wee while are going to have to be very carefully balanced. And all countries are in the same position here, and we can learn from each other, but fundamentally, we're all going through the same incredibly challenging experience.
A lot of our listeners obviously have children who are off school at the moment, and one of the things that has been mentioned is the possibility of some sort of social distancing in schools, for example, going forward. On a practical level, even if class sizes are cut and so on, how realistic is that to ask kids, as young as 5 or 6, to be isolating themselves from other people on an entire school day? How would that work on a practical level, if you're able to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, again, these are all things we're looking at, thinking through the practicalities, but you're right. It's, even if you have only half of a class in a classroom so you can keep desks apart, if you're talking about primary 1, 2, 3 kids, it's going to be very difficult to stop them getting up close to each other, because we all know how children are. That might be more practical if you're talking about primary 6 and 7 children who understand a bit more and can perhaps or are more likely to be able to comply with that. So none of these things are easy, but obviously we want to get children back into education as soon as possible. A bit like the lockdown generally, we're not going to go from schools being completely shut one day to being completely open the next day. Again, it will be phased and gradual. And so, yes, we're looking at, for example, could there be particular year groups go back earlier, or do we split classes into 2? So one half's there in the morning, one half in the afternoon, so that we can have more social distancing. I think it's reasonable to say none of this is ideal. None of this is perfect, and none of it is going to be easy. But a lot of this kind of stuff is going to be necessary for quite some time to come if we're going to keep this virus at the very low levels that we need it to be at, so that we can then have different approaches to try to contain it, where we're just trying to identify people who might have it and then isolate them, as opposed to having to isolate pretty much the whole population.
Staying with schools for a second, I'm sure many of our listeners will have people at home, kids at home that are having to try and homeschool, etc., and hopefully they're getting on okay. But given we're only really a couple of months till the start of what would be the summer holidays, is it a fair assumption to say that we're not likely to see schools back before the summer?
I think it's, well, when we closed schools, I said 2 things then. I said, don't expect to go back after Easter, and it turned out that was right. And I also said we can't guarantee that schools will be back before the summer holidays. That remains the position. So we haven't taken any final decisions that would say schools are definitely not going back before the summer. But what I would say at this stage is that I think it is, look, nothing in life is impossible. But at this stage, it is unlikely that schools will be back to operating as normal before the summer holidays. So if, and it is an if at this stage, some children are back at school, it is likely to be on the more limited basis that I've spoken about illustratively. But none of these decisions have been taken yet. And the reason they've not been taken is that we don't yet have certainty about where the virus is, how low we've managed to suppress it, and what the impact of getting normality back in these different ways might have on that. You might have heard, your listeners might have heard me and others talk about the R number, which is one of the key things in all of this. The R number is the reproduction rate. It's basically the speed at which a virus transmits. When we went into lockdown, the estimate was that the R number was 3, perhaps even higher than that. Now, what that meant was that every person who got the virus was infecting 3 more people. Each of these 3 more people were infecting 3 more people, and so on and so forth. And that's what's called exponential growth. It runs out of control. We think the R number now, because of what everybody has been doing, is down to 0.6 or between that and 1. And that's real progress, because you need to, and that means everybody gets the virus, at most is infecting 1 more person. And that's what's called linear growth as opposed to exponential growth. Very technical, but keeping that number below 1 is really, really important. And getting it as far below 1 is really important, because as you start to allow people to come into contact with more, then it starts to increase again. And if it gets close to 1 or over 1 again, it runs out of control. So it's a very, very narrow margin we're operating within. And we don't yet have enough data and enough confidence to know A, where it is, and B, what the impact of all of these measures might be. And that's why we have to take a bit more time before coming to these final decisions.
With some form of lockdown measures likely to stay in place, whatever that might look like, for the foreseeable future, really. We do have, that many people are keen to maybe see them eased or a degree of flexibility so they can see family, etc., as I touched on. But there are many of our listeners who constantly make the point that they are seeing people breaking these rules quite frequently. It's very anecdotal, but, perhaps having barbecues and house parties in recent good weather probably hasn't helped with that. Why... they're asking us, why aren't we being tougher on people who do flout the rules? Because £30, in a lot of people's opinion, isn't enough to deter anyone from breaking those rules. And that's going to be surely very important going forward as we need people to continue to stick to certain restrictions.
Well, of course, the police can charge people, not just give them a fixed penalty notice if they think they are deliberately and repeatedly flouting the rules. So there is the ability to be tough here. But the police rightly, and us generally, have tried to take an approach that is less about enforcement and more about encouraging people to do the right thing, because we all want to do the right thing to protect our loved ones and our communities. And I believe that the vast, vast majority of people have been doing the right thing and are still doing the right thing. And actually the data that we do have so far proves that, because we might not know exactly where it's got to, but we do know transmission of the virus has been reducing, certainly in the community. It's still probably spreading at a faster rate in places like care homes. So people have been doing the right thing. And, I want to say a big thank you for that. But you will always get a tiny minority on anything that break the rules, and we have to deal with that. And that's the action the police can take through enforcement. But more generally, it gets tougher and tougher to comply with every day that passes. It's one thing being stuck in your house on day 1 or at the end of week 1. It's another thing altogether when you're at the end of the first month. So we know it gets tougher, which is why I keep saying to people, I understand that it gets tougher, but if you find that you are maybe going out a bit more now than you were a couple of weeks ago, please think about that, because you shouldn't be. And if you end up allowing this virus to spread again, what will happen is that we all end up living with these restrictions for even longer than would otherwise be the case. So please, everybody, stick with it. And I know how hard it is, but it is absolutely essential right now to make sure we keep moving in the right direction.
You touched on some of the other health impacts of the virus, mental health and things like that. We have seen some suggestions, some studies that people aren't accessing, things like cancer services because, they're maybe afraid to go and seek help and things like that. It's now been around a month since some cancer screening programmes were put on hold in Scotland. Some of our listeners have been asking, given, hospitals aren't perhaps being overwhelmed by the virus at present, if there's a reason why we aren't reinstating things like screening programmes.
Well, we are already thinking about how we start to bring back some of the procedures that have been postponed. So that work is already underway as part of the general consideration of how we start to get back to some kind of normality, even if it's not normality as we once knew it. But even without that, the message that the NHS is open is a really, really important one. Right now, if you've got symptoms that you're worried about that have got nothing to do with coronavirus, maybe you've discovered a lump, or you've got some unusual bleeding, or you're losing weight for an unexplained reason, anything that normally you would phone your GP or NHS 24, or in more urgent cases, maybe even phone 999. If you are in that situation, do all of these things now. The NHS is not closed for urgent treatment. And it's really important that people know that. So if you're worried about yourself, if you're worried about a loved one, particularly if you're worried about a child, then phone your GP, phone NHS 24, phone an ambulance if it's an emergency situation. And in terms of the stuff that we've had to postpone in order to focus the NHS on dealing with coronavirus, the non-urgent elective treatment, we want to get that back, or as much of that back, as quickly as possible. And that's what we're looking closely at right now.
There will be people listening to this who are really struggling with their mental health, given the restrictions and some of the things we've touched on. What's your message to them? What specific measures can you tell us that you're going to put in place longer term to ensure that those who do need the help get that help?
Well, we've already taken some steps. We've given funding to expand the capacity of some of the existing services. The breathing space service that is operated through NHS 24, for example, the services that organisations like the Samaritans run, these are all there. It's important that people know they're there. We've funded to roll out an initiative called Distress Brief Interventions, which had been piloted in some parts of the country, which is where you can be referred to somebody to talk to and be able to talk to the same person over a period of time. So these are things we're doing right now to say to people, if you need help, please reach out for it. And of course, we also are thinking about what we need to make sure is in place longer term, because I think what we're all living through right now is going to have an impact for a while to come. And that will be true of the population generally, but we know it's particularly true of those who are working in the front line of the NHS or social care. So we're looking in particular at mental health and wellbeing support for those groups as well. I doubt if there's a single person right now who's not having some kind of impact emotionally and in terms of their well-being, because all of us, we're living our lives in ways that is not normal and that none of us have experienced before. And for some people, that will be a much greater impact. So the other thing I would say to anybody listening here is remember to cut yourself a bit of slack right now. It's perfectly okay not to feel okay all of the time, and just not to be too hard on yourself. We're all living through an extraordinary, unprecedented, abnormal situation, and it's going to affect all of us at different times and in different ways, but I don't think there'll be a single one of us who doesn't feel impacted by it at all.
Just a couple of final things I'd like to touch on. We have had some advice this week, or some guidance, I suppose, on the use of the face coverings out in public, and that is slightly different here in Scotland to what we've heard from the rest of the UK. I think some people are concerned that they're maybe getting some mixed messages around what's been put out by the different governments. What would your advice be to the people of Scotland? Should they be listening to you in the first instance, or should that be coming from the Prime Minister?
Well, on this issue, it's the Scottish Government that you should look to for guidance, because for people in Scotland, that is us within this area, because health is a devolved matter that has a responsibility to give that guidance. And so there isn't a confused message in that respect. I don't think the Prime Minister is saying to people in Scotland, don't wear face coverings. He's just, at this stage, choosing not to give that same guidance as we have to people in England. So it's not that the two governments are saying something different to people in Scotland. The message to people in Scotland is clear, it's unequivocal, and nobody is contradicting it, which is the recommendation. It's not mandatory. The police are not going to enforce it and stop you in the street if you're not doing this. But if you are having to be in an enclosed space with other people where you're maybe not able all the time to keep that safe 2 meters, so shopping for food or on public transport, if you're having to take public transport to go to work, that's where we're recommending that you cover your nose and mouth with a scarf or a bandana. It's not a medical mask. And the reason we're doing that is to say there is evidence that it has some benefit, and it means if you have the virus but you might not know about it because you're not experiencing symptoms, if you cover your face and your nose and mouth, then it will reduce the risk of you passing that virus on to somebody else. But the second reason I thought it was important to put out some guidance is to also make sure people are not overestimating the amount of protection it gives you. Wearing a face covering like that doesn't make you invincible against this virus. It might offer you or other people a bit of added protection, but it doesn't change the fact that the most important advice you have to comply with is the stay at home, don't mix with people outside your own household, stay 2 meters apart. So this is an added precaution, but it's not a substitute for the other rules that are in place.
I realise time is tight, so just one final question I wanted to ask you, and ending on a slightly lighter note, hopefully. A few people have been wondering whether you've been seeing the spoof voiceover videos that you've been part of on the internet recently by the comedian Janie Godley. Have you seen them? What do you make of them?
I have seen them. Yeah, I'm not sure I've seen every single one of them, but I do stumble across them on social media sometimes, and they are. Janie Godley is a brilliant comedian in my view, and her voiceovers are very, very funny. They're very rude in terms of the language they use, so sometimes I don't feel able to retweet them. But they're very, very funny. But the really clever thing she's doing with them right now is making people laugh. But she's also, if you listen to them carefully, she's getting the key messages across very, very powerfully. And so, if humour helps us to make people understand what they should be doing right now, then all well and good. So I think she's doing a really good job on that front.
Do you see any, or do you hear any of yourself in some of those?
Well, she has this, not just now, but she's been doing these voiceovers for quite a while. And let me just say, not all the time, but occasionally I watch them and I think, yeah, she must have an insight into what I was really thinking at that point, but I wasn't able to see it. And she manages to voice it in her particular style.
First Minister, thank you for your time.
Thank you.